Hello and welcome to the Canadian Philosophy Show. I'm Michael Robert Caditz. I'll be leading a discussion today. I'm here with Aaron Wang. And I'm venturing into something that's pretty new for me, but it's true to the nature of our show here, which is a student-based show. I'm a student right now at a class at UBC, a graduate seminar called, it's a STS course, sort of an introduction to STS. So for those of you who don't know, STS is a fairly new discipline, which is becoming more and more recognized at respected institutions such as UBC. And it's STS stands for Science, Technology, and Society. Although sometimes I see it shown as science, technology, studies, science and technology studies. But I think science, technology, and society better describes what it is. So I don't want to get into too much about STS now because I actually wanted to go into a specific topic. But suffice it to say for the moment that STS is sort of a new way of looking at science and technology in the context of society. It tends to, I don't want to say be relativistic because I think STS, people would say it's not relativistic, but it tends to shy away from absolutist objective views around science. That is to say that this idea of realism, that there's a real world out there, and science is a way of discovering the real world. And anyone who doesn't believe in science or has some different model, cultures that have some different model, they're just wrong. So it's it's a way of looking at the context of scientific ideas, the context of technology, and according to many STS authoritative people, it's important to view interactions between people and cultures and to take those things into consideration when understanding science and knowledge. And I think STS oftentimes poses a challenge to the traditional view of what constitutes knowledge, a traditional view that we've employed and discussed and sort of chewed at and chewed out at times here on this show. In other words, the JTB, justified true belief, concept of knowledge. So, the JTB model runs into trouble if you're viewing only a slice of reality and that is your definition of reality or of truth. And there are many cultures and subcultures where they have a whole different paradigm for viewing life and viewing reality. And so if you are involved in STS, you might be disinclined to immediately dismiss alternate paradigms, compared to the traditional European and North American or the Eurocentric paradigm of reality. So having given that my very sort of amateurish, I'm sure, preliminary view of STS, I think the important points to get across would be, one, it has an alternative approach to viewing truth, knowledge, science, rationality, but also a rigorous and in a paradoxical way, a scientific approach. It's not just willy-nilly relativism. So I wanted to talk about a chapter in a book which I'm studying by Barry Barnes. So Barry Barnes, or S. Barry Barnes, was a professor of sociology in the UK at the University of Exeter. And he worked at the Social Studies Unit at the University of Edinburgh, also in the 1970s through the 1990s. And they developed the Strong program in the sociology of scientific knowledge. So this particular chapter in the book by Barry Barnes is called Interests and the Growth of Knowledge. This particular chapter, chapter 3, is called The Problem of Imputation. So what is imputation? In this context, what Barnes is talking about, what he's elucidating, he didn't invent the term. He's developing this concept, which is how can beliefs and attitudes and views of reality be attributed to particular social groups based upon things like class, socioeconomic class, or other types of social structures in society. Is there a justifiable way that we can attribute beliefs based upon those types of objective criteria? And so that's what the imputation problem is. That's the problem to be solved. How can we either predict or impute or infer from a person's social class or the social structure in society what that person is likely to believe, if we can do it at all? Is there a way we can do that? So the traditional sort of baseline theory, baseline answer to this problem, the imputation problem, is that we can. This is the starting point. We can, the initial assumption, we can because people act in their self-interest. That's the premise. And so depending on what class in society one is situated, one's self-interest will be distinct. If one is in a very upper class with a lot of wealth and power, then the presumption is it would be in that person's self-interest to have a belief system which would, let's say, to make it very contemporary, let's say, give tax breaks to wealthy people. That and the wealthy person who is situated in that class would believe that that's perfectly legitimate. Whereas someone who was in a low socioeconomic class would, according to this theory, believe that there should be more taxes for the wealthy and tax breaks for poor people, because those respective belief systems would lead to benefit for the respective members of each socioeconomic group. So that's the starting point. The starting point assumptions to be challenged and to be refuted related to this imputation problem. So just to say it one more time, the baseline premises involve the claim that we could impute beliefs and attitudes to people based upon the self-interest of their social class. So as you might guess, this supposed solution to the imputation problem can be pretty quickly and was pretty quickly refuted. If for no other reason than it's empirically wrong. It fails any empirical test. And it does that obviously because there are so many examples, many examples of people who are situated in particular classes that don't subscribe to the beliefs such as what I mentioned. We can see that today. There are many people who, like in the United States. I know you don't like talking about U.S. politics, Aaron, but this isn't U.S. politics. This is sociology, right? So we know that there are many disproportionately large number of working class Americans who support right-wing politicians who I would say, I think many people would say, don't actually, in their policies where they implemented, or to the extent they're implemented, don't benefit working class people, such as tax breaks for the wealthy. Tax breaks for the wealthy don't benefit working class people. Although I'll say it's arguable, because an argument could be constructed that in some way they do because of the trickle down effect. But let's just say that there's been many examples of exceptions to that supposed rule, where empirically it's just very difficult to maintain the viability or the justifiability of a theory that people necessarily will have belief systems which are in their own self-interest or in the self-interest of their class. I mean, you can think of people who are in upper classes who have defied their self-interest and are philanthropic, right? They give a lot of money, or to charities or to causes. They voluntarily will give up some of their wealth, or they may support policies which actually increase taxes, increase their inheritance taxes, increase their income taxes, and so on. And they might join social justice movements which don't wind up providing the best self-interested result. So, yeah, Aaron.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting topic, and I think it kind of the problem of imputation kind of lives and dies on whether or not we can make a rigorous definition of class that or structure, like how you want to divide people into groups in society. Like we talk about, like, middle class. I'm forgetting the term, but like people who are higher class or upper class. There we go. Upper class, middle class, kind of lower class. There's that show that airs sometimes called, was it The Fifth Estate? Because there was the three estates in France, where you had the clergy, then you had the nobility, then you had everyone else. And the idea is then, oh, then there was a fourth estate and there was a fifth estate. Like there's these people who are below, or not, they don't fit into these categories. So it's really a question of how valid these social categories we create are for societies, and whether or not they serve as good scientific instruments for the objective reality of our societies, whether or not these categories are good enough. And I think that's a huge problem as scientists and as people who live in society, and as philosophers.
That's a really good point. So you've suggested a second problem in that traditional model for solving the imputation problem, which is that it can be difficult to define class. So that original model can suggest, or it can be suggested in that original model, that people organize themselves and their beliefs based on their social class and what's in their benefit. And then we can attack that theory, one, on empirically, a lot of people don't do that. And two, what is a class anyway? How do we define class? Which actually is relevant, because that creates difficulty in implementing or in justifying that theory, because you can't really identify classes so neatly.
Yeah, I mean, one easy way of thinking about it is that you could divide a country into classes based off of geographical locations. So in Canada, you could say there's people in Ontario, and then there's people in Quebec, and those people think very differently. And then on the other side of things, you could say, well, there are people who are upper class and people who are middle class, and they think very differently. But let's say if we're still talking about Ontario and Quebec, if you defined those areas based off of those two different metrics, you'd end up with radically different groups of people. I mean, obviously they would still be the same people, but you'd be defining them differently based off of what language or where they live, or how they interact with other people.
It's a really good point. And I think my example of white working class people in the US also can be used to illustrate that same problem, which is they're white and many of them are male, which in those senses makes them high class. They're privileged, they're white, and they're male. On the other hand, they may be working class, which makes them lower class from an economic standpoint. So which way are you slicing the cake? Are you looking at white male privilege, or are you looking at income? And so white working class males seem to be members of at least two classes, and they're positioned quite differently in each class. So we've now elucidated two significant problems for the original solution to the imputation problem, which would be attributing or imputing value systems, belief systems, imputing claims of knowledge, right, to people based on class membership. So along came a guy by the name of Lukács. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And he now sought to revise or update this original model for solving the imputation problem to try and overcome the empirical problem of the fact that there's so many exceptions to the supposed rule, to almost question the rule itself, the class stratification. So what he said was that there's a teleology involved, that each class is sort of moving toward what he called an ideal class consciousness. So it should be the case in an ideal world that people who are very wealthy will have a belief system that favors policies which benefit them, increase their wealth, or protect their wealth. Whereas very poor people should have, in an ideal world, their ideal class consciousness would be tax breaks for poor people and more social programs, well-funded social programs, universal medical care, Social Security payments, that kind of thing. So those would be ideal class consciousness. But the problem is, and the reason there's so many exceptions, is because the people in other classes, especially the upper classes, they restrict and control information in order to manipulate the lower classes into belief systems and supporting policies which are actually not in the latter classes, the lower classes' best interest. So the upper classes interfere with the flow of knowledge as a manipulation, as a strategy toward getting the lower classes to accept their plight and to support policies which actually aren't in the interests of the lower classes. And Lukács didn't leave it quite there. It's a little more complex. There's a counterforce happening, which would be the education and consciousness awareness efforts being made in the lower classes in order to educate them or themselves, or maybe groups from people in higher classes who had a sense of social justice would be making attempts, in fact, to educate and get the correct information to people in lower classes such that they will formulate belief systems which are in their own interest. So that's a countervailing force. So according to Lukács, there's this sort of circular thing going on where it's a dynamic process where people in the upper classes try and restrict information, but there's consciousness raising programs, organizations, and so on, trying to undo that and to provide the correct information to the lower classes such that the lower classes will will form belief systems that are advantageous and will fight for their own interests. So this sort of dynamic view of society. Now, Barry Barnes, I'll get back to Barry Barnes in his chapter called The Problem of Imputation, rejects Lukács' model. He rejects that model. And he rejects it, one, because it's teleological. And Barnes is embedded in a tradition, we talked about STS, which, among other things, doesn't really believe that there's this straight line teleology toward the destiny, toward the point of final success in achieving knowledge, right? That STS sees the development of knowledge as being a much more nonlinear thing, and perhaps even not predictable. So Barnes doesn't like the teleological component of Lukács' model. In other words, there's this, ideal class consciousness that everything's headed toward, and it's slowed down by the efforts of the upper classes. And that's countered by the consciousness raising efforts of the lower classes, but eventually it's going to get to the ultimate predestined conclusion, which is, or it's working toward that, which is the ideal class consciousness. So Barnes rejects that as being too linear, too rigid, too objective of an account. So we're going to get to what Barnes proposes after we talk about one other model that Barnes rejected. And that would be Feuer's model. So Feuer, F-E-U-E-R, hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, came up with a model which is in many ways the opposite, the antithesis of Lukács' model. Feuer went from, Lukács' model of teleology to absolutely no correlations at all. So Feuer said the imputation problem is best solved by saying we can't impute anything other than the characteristics of individuals. So Feuer said that there's really no identifiable, justifiable way to link social classes with belief systems. People are individuals, and they will simply make decisions and create realities, immerse themselves in belief systems which are advantageous to them personally. They may be belief systems that are in alignment with an individual's ideology, person's background, experience. So if a person is a lawyer, maybe the person will develop belief system which favors, which looks, has a positive view of lawyers. Lawyers are the greatest thing that society has ever, thank God for lawyers. Roles in society. So maybe if a person's a father or a mother or a teacher, then the person, according to Feuer, could be expected to form belief systems which are favorable and advantageous for that person's role identification. If a person, is a mother and needs childcare for her children so she can go to work, she's likely to develop a belief system which holds that society should provide free childcare because it's beneficial to her individually. So that would be an example of, I think, what Feuer, according to Barnes, what Feuer's model suggested. So, young professionals would develop belief systems which favor, their freedom and ability. Feuer might say, I'm speculating here, that that women who want to be free to pursue careers will develop belief systems around abortion rights. They should have the right to an abortion. That's what's just. And according to Fuhrer, that would be because that's advantageous to them as individuals in pursuing their individual goals. So that was Fuhrer's response. According to Barry Barnes, Fuhrer's response to the imputation problem is to say, you can't really impute anything based on social groups or social classes. You can't impute or infer or predict what individual beliefs will be. In order to do that, you would have to really look at the individual and the individual circumstances. So according to Barnes now, going back to Barry Barnes, we still have the problem of imputation because Barnes also rejects Fuhrer's model. Barnes rejects Fuhrer's model because it reifies or makes rigid. It atomizes. In other words, it views people as like isolated individuals. It's very individualistic. According to Barnes, Fuhrer does not recognize social structure as being relevant. And finally, according to Barnes, Fuhrer's model suffers from the same fatal flaw as the previous models, which is that it's empirically just not correct. There are many cases of individuals who don't have belief systems or political affiliations or political leanings, who don't vote, who don't support policies, which you would think would be in their own interest. So Barnes has generated his own model, which he goes on to elucidate in this chapter of his book, the chapter called The Problem of Imputation. And so I'm going to get to Barnes' model in a moment, but first I want to remind our listeners that you are listening to the Canadian Philosophy Show. I'm Michael Robert Caditz. I'm here today with Aaron Wang, and I am taking the liberty to discuss a topic that I'm now learning about at a seminar at UBC. It's an STS seminar. It's actually STS cross-listed with philosophy, which is very interesting. I'm taking a little break here from the thread here, Aaron. It's really interesting as I'm discovering, because there seems to be, I'm getting wind of it, sort of a rift between STS and philosophy, and some other other disciplines too, but particularly I think STS and philosophy. It seems, this is after 2 weeks, right? It seems like a lot of STS researchers and writers and authorities and professors and so on have a lot of objections to the way we do philosophy. And they're related to some of the things I just talked about. So philosophy is claimed to be, by some of the STS people, very individualistic and underestimates, to put it mildly, undervalues the importance of social structures and social interactions and that kind of thing. And that's before we even get to objections about the colonial values and colonial attitudes and colonial blind spots of Eurocentric philosophers. That's a whole other topic, because STS also seems to attract indigenous research by indigenous people who have raised many objections to the way Western philosophy is done, and the way it's premised upon certain colonial attitudes, and how that actually causes errors in reasoning. but we'll get to that another time.
Yeah, I think that these things are very interesting. It's not particularly surprising that these types of interdisciplinary studies that kind of link philosophy and sociology and society, technology, when you link all of those ideas together, it's not really surprising that there might be methodological differences between those different sciences. Um, there's a lot of just very real differences in how scientists, philosophers, I'm thinking now of theories of history and historians operate. So when you combine so many different types of things together and make a new subfield, you have to negotiate a whole new set of methodologies that are standard practice in that field. And I think because STS is so young, I took a computer science and ethics course, and we talked a lot about the history of technology. Um, because these fields are so young, a lot of those methodologies are kind of being hammered out by these academics and academics and scholars now. So it'll be really interesting to see in the next couple years and so on what type of new research methodologies and practices they develop as they kind of go back and forth and see what works.
Just as an example, this is still part of the interlude, and I'll get back to the thread, but I'm having a little bit of a personal, revelation here. So I want to express it. So like when I look at you, Aaron, I'm looking at your video. Supposing somebody said to me, describe Aaron, or describe that object in the video, like exactly what is that thing? Be as specific as you can. So coming from a Western background, scientific, the Western idea of science background, I probably would be inclined to describe you physically and show off my, knowledge of anatomy, maybe give some, use some, physiological terms or anatomical terms, describe your head, and inside there's a brain, and, the brain is made of different kinds of matter, and there's, neurological things happening. And I'm not very good at this, but I could give a complete physical or scientific description as best I could, right? There's blood flowing through your veins, and there's nerve endings, and the nerves are sending signals back to your brain to tell your brain if you need to move your hand off the flame. My inclination would probably be to begin with that sort of explanation if I were asked to describe what I'm really seeing, what's the real thing that I'm seeing. But one could imagine a whole different, perhaps incommensurable paradigm, which describes something totally different. Like, I see, the son of John, your whatever your father's name is. I see someone who is who is smiling and must have had a really great experience today. And I see someone who is part of a culture part of a people which has just experienced a severe drought and just had to move, plant crops in a new location. And that's what I'm seeing, that a member of that group. So I could go on with a whole different slice of reality, and that second characterization could be the lens through which I view the world. I might not be interested in or focused on anatomy or on matter, or the physical matter that, of which you're constituted and how it works. So I think that's a little bit of what I'm learning about what STS is suggesting, which is that there may be more than one, or in fact, there is more than one way of slicing reality. And that traditional philosophers, for example, might have one way of slicing reality, and any other viewpoint is just considered to be irrational. Any other slice of reality is considered to be irrational or not justified, and therefore doesn't qualify under JTB, and it's not the way the world really is. So I think STS challenges this concept that the world is a particular way, and there is a suggestion that concept of what is, of reality, is a very biased uh, uh, slice of looking at the world. But anyway, I want to get back to Barry Barnes from his chapter, The Problem of Imputation, in his book, Interests and the Growth of Knowledge. So to review quickly, Barnes rejects the original base solution to the imputation problem, the problem of imputation, the original solution being belief systems are divided along class lines. He also rejects Lukács' update to that, which is that ideal class consciousness is divided along class lines, but various classes, especially the lower classes, haven't actually achieved their ideal consciousness because of interference from the upper classes, restrictions on information. And Barnes also rejects Lukács' model, Feuer's model, which goes the opposite way. Feuer's model saying there's really no basis for imputation at all. People just do individually what's best for them. So what does Barnes say? Barnes says that the justifiable imputations that can be made are based on structure in society. Now, structure is not the same as class. Structure is a much more, in a way, it's a more general term. I mean, classes can be structure, but there's many other things that can constitute structure. And I'll give some examples of that in a minute. There's various types of social stratifications, which aren't class stratifications. And maybe you were hinting at this a little bit, Aaron, when you said that it's hard to define class. Maybe that's part of what Barnes is getting at here, when he says that there's many ways, there's varied methods, there's different methods for how we would divide up culture or identify structures in culture, and many of them are not based on class. So Barnes argues that there are no general laws. Beliefs are structurally contingent and therefore dynamic because social structures are always changing. They're constantly changing.
Sorry, just stop for a second there. What do you mean by laws, like general laws, as in like that, like not the class consciousness model?
Right. So a general law would be, for example, the law implied in the original solution to the imputation problem, which is that we can impute beliefs to members of particular social classes. So that would be a general law. Or a general law would, Lukács also then suggested a general law, which is that each social class has an ideal class consciousness, and there's a teleological movement toward that class consciousness, which is interfered with by, with restrictions on information. So those would be like general laws. Yeah.
So far, Barnes has suggested that we use the term structures, and he's rejecting the notion of a generalized law.
Right.
Okay. All right. I think I'm keeping up.
Yeah. Although there's always room for objections here, and I can immediately see that one could say, "Well, isn't that a general law?" Right? Isn't he making his own general law?
Yeah. I mean, you could say that. What is the thing? Some people will say that, I guess, against postmodernism, like if you say there is no absolute truth, well, then the claim there is no absolute truth is an absolute truth claim. So therefore, you're stuck in this hole, and then people will come back on you and say, well, that's just way too reductionistic, and you need to look at things in its full complexity. And there's kind of this, circle back and forth that goes around about, well, is this appropriate? Is this not appropriate? Is this the proper tool? Is this not the proper tool? Like, it really gets down to, what do you think the limits of knowledge are in this specific area of study? Fortunately for Barnes, he's not talking about a general philosophical principle. He's talking about societies, structures of societies, and so this is somewhat testable, somewhat inductive. He can look at various societies and see various structures, and that kind of lends weight, I think, to some of his points.
Right, right. By the way, you raised an interesting point about the contradiction implicit in relativism. We've certainly discussed that in the context of ethics and morality. It's also a contradiction that's come up in other places. It comes up with logical positivism. But it comes up here too, and I've noticed in my reading so far that in the discipline of STS, one of the vulnerabilities that advocates of some of the STS theories are well aware of and are constantly defending themselves against. It's interlaced throughout the readings I've done so far. There always seems to be this defense against the charge of relativism, because that seems to be the implication when you argue that, well, for different cultures and different subcultures, there may be a different slice of reality, which it would be wrong to dismiss as simply being wrong. As soon as you go there, you are now opening yourself up to a charge of relativism, where you would just say that, well, whatever a culture believes is just as good knowledge as what any other culture believes. But in the readings that I've done so far, there's a defense, often defenses against that, which I won't get into right now. But nonetheless, one can still raise an objection that that you're venturing into that relativistic territory when you do what what some of these guys are doing and say, well, we really need to look at each culture's value system as its own legitimate system and not discredit it merely because it's not the same as ours. And so the contradiction arises if you were to say, and that's the way it is. My belief, which is the correct belief, is that there are no absolute objective beliefs. Because is that an absolute objective belief, or could I be wrong too?
Yeah, it's tricky. And I mean, if I remember we had that last show on rationality, if we were to hold to the three laws of logic, and those are absolute, and we're going to be logical, rational reasoning creatures who obey those logics, then it's like, okay, well, then we've reached a contradiction, and so therefore we have to now reject postmodernism, or we have to reject STS entirely because it's relativistic. We have to reject relativism because it's logically contradictory, or we have to somehow work around this and say sometimes logical contradictions happen. And this is the notion, I think, of a paradox, is where you have two things that are seemingly contradictory but are actually true. And I think in physics we see this with something like, and I'm really going to step on people's toes when I say this, that like there's this thing called particle wave duality. It's a model for how light behaves, or if you want to be fancy, electromagnetic radiation. And you can see light as a particle, or you can see light as a wave, depending on which experiment you do. So then, is light a particle or is light a wave? Well, it's both. It depends on what experiment and what circumstances you put it under. So this is the so does that mean what's the absolute truth then? Is the absolute truth that light is a wave or light is a particle? It has to be one. It can't be both. Well, sometimes you reach these paradoxes where it is both. And that's where we have to re-examine our laws of logic and see if they fit within reality. And that's a difficult thing to do, is to determine, is this a contradiction or is this a necessary paradox? And we have to re-examine our logical systems.
Right. So that is something that comes up in STS. And so T.S. Kuhn, who's considered to be one of the pioneers of STS, talked about incommensurability. So one paradigm may be a completely different language than another paradigm, right? And So the paradigm of logic with the rules that you described, right? The law of non-contradiction, the law of what can't be in the middle. What's it
Yeah,
called? The
excluded middle. Law of the
excluded middle,
excluded middle. Yeah.
right?
And the law of identity or principle of identity.
Yes, those are situated within a particular paradigm. But what if one isn't immersed in that paradigm? What if one has a different paradigm? So you've already, given an example of that. If if your paradigm is such that you're studying that light can act as a particle or it can act as a wave, and if you're involved in that type of research and you're in that world, then the law of non-contradiction or of excluded middle simply doesn't make any sense to you, because light behaves differently under different ways of different contexts, right? Different ways of experimenting with it.
We should probably
So,
get back onto the main thread when we still have time.
yeah. So anyway, so Barnes is saying that that what matters here is the structure of society. So let me read. I just want to read straight from Barnes, because my first question was, well, what does he mean by structure? What does he mean? So he says, hence the imputation of beliefs via interests to acceptable social structural categories is a procedure which avoids the obvious problems of Führer's individualism without any necessary corresponding losses of empirical relevance or testability, or any retreat into reifying metaphysics. Such structural imputations predict that the form, distribution, and influence of beliefs will vary with social structural changes, and this is the basis upon which they can be empirically checked. They cannot be directly checked, like Furr's individualistic imputations perhaps could be, by counting how many individuals of different kinds adhere to a particular belief or employ a particular concept. So I still wanted to know, well, exactly what are social structures after I read that. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of Barnes' model is he doesn't give a lot of examples. He gives a couple examples. So let me quickly, he gives an example, a little bit dated, but he gives an example of a dispute around evolutionary theory between Person's model of gradual change and the Mendelian model of sudden discontinuous disruptions. So Barnes claims that where people aligned in that debate, right, what they claimed was knowledge, either the correct knowledge that evolution happens according to Person's model, or claiming that evolution happens according to the Mendelian model. Where people aligned on that were a result of structures having to do with industrialization and eugenics. So let me I think I have enough time to quickly read straight from Barnes. He says, in short, eugenics can be regarded as one of the ideologically determined modes of thought characteristic of the rising professional middle class in the context of English society in the period 1890 to 1910, and intelligible in terms of its particular social interests. And many of the controversial features of the related biometrical knowledge and technique as it stood at this time can likewise be imputed to the operation of these particular interests. If we wish to understand the content of biometrical knowledge, we have to make reference to the social structure at the most general level. Although the evidence is less clear-cut and will not be discussed here, it would seem that the vigor with which the controversial claims of biometry were opposed and countered by the British Mendelians should also be related to social structure. Dogmatic stress on discontinuity and unpredictability in evolution can be linked with conservative opposition to industrialization, to a rationally controlled urbanized society, and to what William Bateson called the blighted atomistic individualism of the utilitarians. The interests of classes and occupations which depended upon the traditional order, land rather than manufacture, the country rather than the city, scriptural rather than scientific authority, made for hostility to eugenics and its associated lore and cosmology. Thus, we have here a controversy sustained by two sets of conflicting, incompatible, particular social interests. So that is an example, one of a couple examples, albeit a little bit dated, that Barnes gives for social structure being correlated, if not causal, certainly correlated with beliefs. Structural. So that's what Barnes claims as the solution to the imputation problem. Is it's the structural, the changing structural components of a society at any given time, which from which we can infer or correlate beliefs and attitudes and ideas about what constitutes knowledge. So I want to ask Aaron, do you buy it so far? Like what? I
Well,
think
I think there's actually a
yeah,
vulnerability here, and
yeah.
that's that um, which of these paradigms are the most important ones? Because he just mentioned, eugenics in the late 19th century, early 20th century. I mean, it's also true that, there were Seventh-day Adventist people who were um, building schools and shelters and things like that in the South after the Emancipation of Proclamation, ending of slavery. So it's really, and those people were of the exact same like white middle class background, so you say. So like which in that time period you could say like, oh well, there was this Seventh-day Adventist social movement to build schools and stuff like that, and I actually don't know if that was a real movement. I just know there was this one specific person that did that, and then they built like 4 schools. So I don't even know if that was like a real movement, but that's kind of the question of like, is that considered a real social thing if it doesn't have a large social impact on academia as this argument? Are only these large academic sounding arguments the ones that really matter? Like what arguments matter, what arguments don't matter, what paradigms matter, what paradigms don't matter. So you're still in this kind of quagmire of you don't have a standard for which social structures are the ones that should be studied and which social structures are the ones that are kind of irrelevant and not necessary, which I think is a really big problem to solve.
I think that's a great objection. I'm going to bring that into my class because I think what you're suggesting is almost a hypocrisy. If Barnes is doing what you're suggesting, there's a certain element of hypocrisy because one of the I know the claims that he makes elsewhere, and I read a couple other chapters in the book, and that some of the STS people make is that one of the faults, one of the problems in Western science is that it's the findings are subject to bias, especially a type of confirmation bias that they describe, where you're only going to discover things in the realm of where you're looking, and so you tend to exclude other explanations because you didn't look there. So he's sort of doing that here. He's saying, okay, I'm seeing this phenomenon happen, where there's a divide in opinion and beliefs around how evolution works. And so I think where I'm going to look for that is in this rejection or fear about industrialization, or
Mm-hmm.
the people's views about eugenics. So he comes up with a theory, and then he looks for evidence to support his theory, and then he
Mm-hmm.
advocates that theory of correlation, or perhaps even he's going as far as causation, right? But he, in a way, is guilty of the very thing that he criticizes, which is a sort of a confirmation bias. As you just pointed out, Aaron, there's many other dynamics and structures that were happening in society at that time. Did he consider those things, or did he only consider his favored theory?
Well, I mean, it's important to kind of give him the benefit of the doubt, and this is just an example. He might not have considered it the most important example in this time period. One of the benefits of this example is that it's well documented, and this is actually kind of the point that I kind of want to say as well, is that like one of the things that I learned from studying world history, which was all of history up till 1500. It was a first year course that I took at VIU, one of the best courses I took. was that there's so much we just don't know. There's so much that's undocumented about
Right.
ancient and older civilizations. So there are just so many things that we'll never know, and we have limited knowledge, and then we have sources, and then those sources we know sometimes they're unreliable, and they're the only sources we have. So what
Right.
do you do when all you have is unreliable sources? Well, you do the best you can. You try to verify against other sources. You make very logical, intricate arguments about based off of what we know about the society at the time, based off of archaeological evidence. Like you do the very, very best you can with limited information, but you always have to remember you have limited information, and you have this, always this probabilistic sense that, like, I might have a consensus among my peers, I might have done my best, but maybe I'm wrong. There's some uncertainty there, and that is really terrifying as someone who's a philosopher or a scientist, to think that you develop this immaculate theory that in the end has introduced uncertainty to it.
And that's a source of bias, right? So if you're only studying cultures at times where there's a good written record, then you're going to be biased in your findings. There's various times when I see in the news some evidence just emerged, from a ancient culture, Egyptian culture or something, or even other types of tribal cultures where they knew more about science than we thought. That
Mm-hmm.
some piece of
Yep.
information, some piece of
Yep.
evidence was found, from a time period when there's not a lot of documentation, but what did suddenly emerge because of an archaeological find or something was, wow, they seem to know about, something about the human body or some scientific concept that we didn't know they knew.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, great point, Aaron. I wanted to finish by giving my examples. So this isn't what Barnes said, but I have some contemporary examples of what I think might qualify as social structures, which would be worth, in the future considering as drivers of belief systems. If Barnes' model of structural imputation is correct. So social media, the fact the demographics of non-white people are gaining percentage of population in places like the United States, the pandemic, and global warming. So those things, some of those are natural things, but I think they have social implications. They create social structure around them. We're all too familiar with the social structure around, vaccines and masks, and we're familiar with the social structure that's formed around anthropogenic global warming. Those who deny that it's the global warming as a result of human activities, and then of course social media, the way that influences opinion and allows information to be spread, sometimes misinformation. So all those things I think are social structures which we might be able to say under Barnes' model help drive belief systems.
Yeah, to add one more to that list, I mean,
Yeah,
you could look at the internet and how that changed communication, how that changed access to information, and that access to information, like some people call the age we live in now the information age. So that technology of the internet changed everything about how we talk, how we communicate, what we can communicate, what we can know, and what we can learn.
right. And if I'm if I'm a white person living in a area which is becoming increasingly uh, minority represented by minorities or people of color and that kind of thing, I might be afraid, right? I might be fearful, and my fear, rational or not, my fear might cause me to have certain belief systems. I might believe that immigrants are taking away my job, and so that may be my belief system, and in that way, I think Barnes might be right, because my belief system is caused or influenced at least by the social structure, which is the change, the demographic changes. Okay. Anyway, that wraps it up. That was my sort of rendition here of what I think Barry Barnes is saying in his book, Interests and the Growth of Knowledge, particularly Chapter 3, The Problem of Imputation. Thanks very much, Aaron Wang, for helping me in my presentation today. My name is Michael Robert Caditz, and you have been listening to the Canadian Philosophy Show. And I need to tell you that we post our archives on Mixcloud. If you want to hear this show and previous shows, go to mixcloud.com/The Canadian Philosophy Show. Thanks again for listening.